When the Russians come in and take these cities like Pokrovsk, or if they march on to Zaporozhye, which you said is a large city, do they get emptied out
Well,
largely before the fighting starts, or like
right.
what
Yeah.
happens to the people living there?
Yeah. Most of them are evacuated. Most of them leave the city. There are always some hangers on, some who just do not want to leave their properties and just want to wait for the Russians. And I remember that happened in Avdiivka, for example. Avdiivka was really pummeled. There were hundreds and hundreds of FABs, these huge, 1 ton, 2 ton bombs dropped on Avdiivka. But when the Russians took it, these people, a lot of older men and women came out of their basements and hugged the Russian soldiers. There were, I mean, I think we're talking about a pretty small part of the population, maybe 1, 2, 3% or something, but they just stay. And I think that's probably true in Pokrovsk.
Okay, yeah, I'm wondering because while we're still in the Donbass and Zaporozhye, these are regions that were largely sympathetic to Russia. So I'm just wondering if
Oh
do the
yeah, yeah,
civilians,
very sympathetic.
right? So the civilians that are living there in these cities, do they feel occupied fully by the Ukrainians? And when the Russians
Yeah,
come and take it, if they fled for safety, they can't go back to their city, right? Because now it's
right,
Russian occupied territory. The Ukraine won't let them, right? So, well, what
right.
is that? What
Yeah, it's going
happens?
to
They're
be hard,
permanently
I guess.
moved.
Right. Yeah, well, that's a good question. I wondered about that. I think, that there are ways to get there's certainly ways to get to Russia. If they're allowed to leave Ukraine, there's always ways to, to to enter Russia, via a third country. So I think that's probably what a lot of these people are doing. It's just, I can't blame them. Yeah, I would rather if I were a resident of a city like Pokrovsk, I would rather, be there under Russian occupation. I think the great majority of the residents think that way. Um, but, for the Russians to take Pokrovsk, they've got to pummel it because the Ukrainian soldiers are using these buildings as fortresses. This is their using the basements, and they're using the apartment towers as fortresses. They have their gun nests up there on the higher floors, and so a great deal of damage is done to these cities because they're fought within the cities, and so it's got to be, first of all, a terrifying experience, and then a real chance that you're going to be killed. So say even if I want to be under Russian occupation, I don't, I don't want to live through this battle. So a lot of these people do agree to be evacuated, but there's always a hardcore, you know, it's
I'm
just
not
a
leaving.
few. Again, it
Right,
just maybe a couple percent. Yeah, I am. Yeah, I think that's always true. Actually, like in India, I'm not leaving this house, and they stay,
right.
and some of them do get killed, but others survive, and they are able to welcome the Russian soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of wonder if you're a Ukrainian occupying these cities that are in eastern Ukraine, places like Pokrovsk, are you not worried if the majority of citizens are sympathetic to Russia? I mean, do they view these citizens as potential informants or enemies? Or do they realize they're not wanted there? Like, I think that's something that
I think,
most people
yeah,
that
right, right.
I was just going to say, I think most people that don't have a firm understanding of the conflict in Ukraine just to assume that, okay, yeah, Russia's invading and that everybody's in eastern Ukraine is like these evil Russian barbarians are coming through and, burning our cities and raping our women and killing our men. That's the image that they try to present without realizing that actually these people have been involved in a civil war since 2014,
Right.
fighting against the Western Ukraine, that this really was a civil war conflict, and that the majority of these people in eastern Ukraine are Russian speakers, identify as Russians. Their rights have been trampled since the overthrow of their democratic elected government in 2014. They have been waging this war for a long time. Yeah, and so, but it just
Yeah,
makes me wonder, like all these people, it makes me feel like I'm surprised that there aren't more uprisings. I wonder how Ukraine's able to kind of control a population,
yeah.
in eastern Ukraine that doesn't want to be under their control.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they've got all the guns, that's,
Okay, yeah.
and, organized violence, it can, yeah, numbers, you can, right. Maybe, you know how it is, right? Yeah, I think the majority, clearly the majority of the people in these towns in eastern Ukraine and Donetsk do not want to be under Ukrainian control, want to be part of Russia. If I remember correctly, it was actually the rebellion that set off the civil war, the rebellion against the new Ukrainian regime that took power in 2014, started in the Kramatorsk Slavyansk area. So again, that's where it started. Okay? So when the Russians get there, there's going to be a sense, finally, this is this objective was achieved. No, recently I haven't heard anything, but I remember in the first year or two of the war that you would hear accounts from Ukrainian soldiers, actually complaints, saying the people here they're all pro-Russian, just really annoyed by the fact, but they admitted it was true.
Yeah, well, do you think this war you said you think it can grind down a lot more, there's a lot more war left. Do you think this is going to extend well into 2026 even? I mean, do you think this is going to evolve? Will we have direct NATO involvement? I mean...
Yeah, well, that's the fear. I mean, this is the thing. This is the argument, too, that I've heard from both sides. Like Jim Jatras and others, I think a lot of people within Russia, he's not Russian, but he's very closely tied to Russia. He was a former State Department employee. And says that he thinks it actually increases the danger of NATO involvement just by extending the war, by going at it slowly. That eventually,
I agree.
I can understand his point. I see it. And now others like Eve Smith, she's made the argument of naked capitalism, that you don't make any sudden moves around a crazy person. She puts it that way. It's actually the Russians want to move slowly because a sudden move, like a sudden breakthrough, a big aero offensive, a sudden march on Kiev, that could, provoke an hysterical, reckless response by the West.
Right.
But I can see both sides of it. I understand, I can see both sides of this argument.
Yeah, I think just the most damning thing is just when we take a step back and just realize where we are when we have Trump saying, "Oh, I'm done talking with Putin. He's got 10 days." Just issuing an ultimatum like that. When we have a U.S. general talking about invading Russia, Kaliningrad, when there's open discussion of shooting longer range missiles into places like Moscow or St. Petersburg. Supposedly, Trump asked Zelensky, "Do you think you can hit Moscow or St. Petersburg?" I mean, just that's an insane statement. Apparently, tactical nukes are being sent to Great Britain. Like, what's going on? All these political leaders are saying, get ready for war with Russia. We've been saying that in large sense. MI6, CIA, they're already at war with Russia. So it's just the problem with moving this slow. Just look at where we are from the start of this SMO to where we are now, and the types of conversations we're having. And we're looking at, we're wanting to punish countries like China and India because Russia is still doing well. We're completely running empty on all of these munitions. Ukraine is running out of men. We have nothing left in our arsenal. Like you said, like these bone-crushing sanctions, secondary tariffs or whatever that we're wanting to place on countries like China and India, like this is just a sign of desperation because nothing else has worked. So you're just saying insane crap and just hoping that something happens. I don't know, but like we said, it's going to hurt the American people more than anybody. And militarily, like, what can we do? We've already sent everything. We don't have any more, air defense systems or anything like this. You were just saying that all of the militaries, nobody's signing up. Nobody wants this war. So I just don't understand Trump. He's so, I don't know. You think that somebody that became a billionaire would be intelligent, that you have to be smart, the art of the deal. You have to understand people and understand the big picture to be able to make it. But maybe our system's just so broken that nothing about America is meritocracy. Nothing about America is actually, if you're competent and smart and do well, that doesn't get you to the top. Instead, it's just if you just lie and just have been overly confident or whatever, or you have the right connections, then you can make it. That's the only way. Like how is he so stupid? Like I just don't understand. That was always something in the back of my mind. I was like, well, Trump was a successful businessman, right? He built a business empire. He should have some common sense, but it seems like he has zero. I don't get it.
Yeah, right. Well, I suppose like just being successful within like within the world of New York real estate, and also of reality TV. There's one thing. It shows you have to have a certain kind of smarts, but it just doesn't necessarily apply to international relations. It really doesn't. And there are people that know how work very well within their own milieus, but they just don't understand other countries and other people. So they never took an interest in it, and it's always, just a mystery to them. They kind of assume that they got to be like the people they know and respond to the kind of pressures that, they know how to apply to, other people that are dealing within again, your very small circle. And it just doesn't work that way. There's international relations is something completely different. And you need to, somebody who's got smarts, well, he also has to have a certain amount of humility. You say, okay, I understand this very well. I need experts. And the thing is, Trump hasn't done that. He's found loyalists. So he's got Steve Witkoff, who's, again, is probably one of his better representatives, or, clearly a smart guy, but he doesn't know anything about these countries. He doesn't know anything about international relations. And, again, you have to have the experts. You really do. Again, he suspects he has experts, with good reason, you can say, yet he can't do without them.
Yeah, I mean, if we had a system that truly worked, you feel like people like Colonel Douglas McGregor would become our Secretary of Defense, and we could have people like John Mearsheimer and, advising Thomas Massie with Jeffrey Sachs. Like, that's how it should be, but we just those guys have been exiled. You're not allowed to have it. The only people that are allowed to be in the government are the ones that are just spouting nonsense and that I want to live in this crumbling false reality that America is a hyperpower that can just dictate reality wherever it wants, left and right. And it's scary, man.
Yeah. I remember actually, one person who's very much part of the dissident community now is Chas Freeman, the former interpreter for President Nixon in China, and then ambassador to Saudi Arabia, a very illustrious diplomatic career. He was considered for a high-level position in the State Department under Obama, but he was shot down by the Zionists. That's the kind of thing that happens.